It was the winter of 1944, and the frost in the air was thick enough to bite. The POW camp stood like a fractured bone in the frozen landscape, a jagged outpost amidst the wintry desolation of Europe. Snow fell heavily, coating everything in a blanket of cold, and the trees that lined the perimeter of the camp stood like skeletal sentinels, stripped of their leaves, their branches reaching up to a leaden sky. The only sound was the howling wind, pushing the snow in sharp gusts that cut through the thin jackets of the men inside the camp. The ground was slick with ice, and every step seemed to echo in the silence that hung over the place, broken only by the occasional shout from the guards or the clinking of metal as the prisoners moved between their barracks and the mess hall. Inside, the mess hall was no sanctuary. It was cold, the walls bare except for the occasional swath of peeling paint and the faintest traces of old soot from the stove in the corner. It was a place where prisoners gathered, not just for meals but for moments of brief, reluctant camaraderie, if you could call it that. They were divided not only by language and nationality, but by the years of captivity, the despair, and the simple act of survival. Each soldier, whether British, French, American, or German, found themselves sitting side by side with their supposed enemies, forced to coexist in a cramped space where tension thickened like the smoke rising from the stove. The meals were often meager, sometimes little more than watery soup and stale bread, a daily reminder of how far they had fallen from the lives they once knew. Yet the mess hall was where the men came together, where conversations, whispers of home, and sometimes even the occasional laugh broke the silence of the barracks. Despite everything, this was where the human connection remained, however fragile it might be. It was in this dismal, frost-bitten place that an unlikely idea began to take root: the formation of an orchestra. The men, despite their circumstances, still carried with them fragments of their past lives. Among the prisoners were a few men who had once been musicians. One had been a violinist before the war, another a clarinet player, and a few had dabbled in various instruments, their talents long forgotten in the chaos of battle. It started with an offhand comment, a joke shared by a few men sitting together during one of their rare moments of leisure. "Why don't we start a band?" one said, laughing at the absurdity of it all. "We've got nothing else to do, right?" But then something unexpected happened. The idea stuck. A handful of men began to gather after meals, some slipping out of the barracks with instruments they'd managed to salvage or cobble together. A harmonica found here, a broken violin there. The prisoners, desperate for something to remind them of life before the war, began to practice together in the cold corners of the camp. At first, it was just a small, tentative attempt. A few hesitant notes of familiar melodies from home. But the music began to spread, weaving its way through the cold barracks and into the very bones of the camp. The mess hall, a place once filled with the sounds of clattering trays and low murmurs, became a different space altogether. It was here that the orchestra would play, not for an audience, but for themselves. The music wasn't just a distraction. It was a lifeline, a thread that connected them to their humanity, to a time before the chaos of war, when they had been something more than prisoners. It was in this broken, bitter place that the first notes of what would become a remarkable act of unity began to echo, rising above the thrum of war and the chill of the winter night. It didn't happen overnight. The idea of an orchestra, born out of the bitter cold and desperation of a POW camp, required more than just a handful of men with a shared love of music. It needed something else. The fragile thread of hope that even in the direst of circumstances, something beautiful could emerge. That spark, at first a fleeting thought, was nurtured by those who remembered life before the war, who could still recall the sweet sound of a violin or the thrum of a drum beat as something more than a distant dream. It all began with a man named Carl Fischer, a former conductor in the German army before the war had swept him into captivity. He had been a musician long before he had ever worn a uniform. When the war broke out, his life had been consumed by orders and strategies, but music never left his soul. He had carried with him, as one does a cherished memory, the sheet music of Beethoven and Bach, the scores he had once conducted in concert halls, now forgotten amid the battlefield. It was a stroke of chance that Fischer crossed paths with an American soldier named Frank Miller, a former clarinet player with the New York Philharmonic. Their initial conversation was one of guarded curiosity, each unsure how the other would react to such a bizarre proposition. Miller had barely touched his clarinet in years, having long since resigned himself to the harsh realities of life as a prisoner. But Fischer's mention of music, its familiar, comforting notes, piqued something inside him. Maybe it was the memory of simpler days, or perhaps the sheer absurdity of the idea, but Miller found himself nodding. He agreed to join, and the first tentative rehearsals began. They were careful at first, forming a tentative, unsanctioned group. Fischer had no official orders to form an orchestra, and Miller certainly wasn't allowed to practice music in a POW camp. But in the quiet corners of the barracks, where the guards couldn't hear, the orchestra began to take shape. It started with just a few instruments: Miller's clarinet, a broken violin that had been hastily repaired, and an old accordion that had been scavenged from the camp's supply crates. Slowly, other men trickled in, men who remembered how to play, men who had once been musicians before the war, and men who had never played an instrument but were eager to try. There was John Klein, a lanky American who had once been a trumpet player in high school. There was Pierre Lemoine, a French soldier with the most beautiful baritone voice, though he could barely read music. And then there was Ivan Petrov, a Russian soldier who had never held a violin before, but whose hands, trembling from the cold, seemed to find a natural rhythm on the strings. These men, once strangers and now bound together by circumstance, began to rehearse in secret. Their first few attempts were awkward, false starts, sour notes, and a tangle of rhythm that left them frustrated. But they kept going, day after day. For weeks they played in hushed silence. No one else knew. The guards were too busy with their own duties, the other prisoners too focused on surviving to care about music. But the members of this ragtag orchestra did not stop. Music, they found, was a different kind of sustenance. It filled the empty spaces in their hearts that hunger could not, and it soothed the raw nerves that war had frayed. One evening, after another failed practice, Fischer, the conductor, the guiding force, stood before the group, a small makeshift baton in his hand. He looked at them, his face lined with fatigue but lit by a spark of passion. "We are not just soldiers," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of both their reality and their dreams. "We are artists. This is our rebellion, our resistance. To them we may be prisoners, but through this music, we are free." It was that moment. the point where the music transformed from a fleeting distraction into something more profound, that solidified their resolve. They were a team now, not just a group of men clinging to the remnants of their past lives, but a unit bound by purpose. The orchestra was born from nothing more than broken instruments and the shared hope that something beautiful could emerge from the worst of circumstances. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, but after a few weeks of practice, they were ready to perform. The first time the orchestra played together in full, their sound was shaky, but it was theirs. And for the first time since their capture, the men who made up this group of unlikely musicians felt something they hadn't in months: unity. A unity not forged through command or military orders, but through the music they played, the music that connected them to each other, to their pasts, and to something beyond the war. The music did more than fill the empty air of the camp. It became their refuge, their heartbeat in a place that had long since lost its rhythm. In the dead of winter, with the barracks colder than the men's resolve, music was a warmth they couldn't touch but could feel deep within their chests. For the men in the orchestra, it was no longer just a distraction from the ceaseless hunger or the gnawing isolation. It was a lifeline, a thread that connected them to something outside the camp's steel fences, a thread that didn't yet sever with every passing day. For the first time in months, they weren't just soldiers or prisoners. They weren't just faceless pawns in a war that had stripped away their identities. They were artists again, and in a way, that made all the difference. The feeling of a violin's bow against taut strings, the subtle vibration of a trumpet bell, the breath and pulse of the clarinet. Each note brought a fleeting sense of familiarity, of home, of a time before the war that had taken so much from them. For a moment they could forget the bitter cold, the rationed bread, the looming shadow of guards patrolling the camp. But even more, music became a way to survive the mental and emotional toll the war had exacted on them. The isolation of the camp was suffocating. Though surrounded by hundreds of other men, the soldiers felt more alone than they had ever been, each one adrift in a sea of uncertainty and fear. The sounds of war were ever present. The echo of distant gunfire, the rumble of artillery in the distance, the relentless march of German boots. But inside the camp, amidst the endless hours of waiting, the music allowed them to escape that reality, even if just for a moment. In the orchestra, time didn't matter. The minutes bled into hours, but it felt different. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion of marching, of guarding, of surviving. It was the mental fatigue that came with being trapped in an endless cycle of waiting and wondering. When would they be liberated? When would the war end? Would they survive it at all? In those rare moments when they played together, the outside world fell away. They were no longer prisoners. They were musicians again, making music not for anyone else but for themselves, for their souls that had been long starved. It was Frank Miller, the clarinet player, who first recognized the change in himself. He had come to the camp a broken man, his spirit crushed by the loss of so many friends, his mind clouded by the horrors he had witnessed. Before the war, he had been a musician with dreams of playing in concert halls. But those dreams had seemed as distant as the stars. In the mess hall, however, something shifted. He found himself carrying the music with him, even after the orchestra had stopped playing. He could hear it in his head when the camp was silent, could feel the pull of the clarinet's haunting call, its familiar voice in his hands. He would hum melodies under his breath as he sat in the barracks, swaying gently to the music only he could hear. The music had reclaimed him, had given him something to hold on to in the chaos. For Carl Fischer, the conductor, the music was something even more profound. He had been through the worst of the war, had seen the toll it had taken on his fellow soldiers and the people around him. But it was only in those fleeting moments of music, standing at the front of the orchestra with his arms raised, that he felt a sense of control. The chaos of the camp, the confusion of being a prisoner, could be held at bay, just for a moment, by the steady beat of the music. In those moments, he wasn't a prisoner. He wasn't a soldier trapped in a hopeless conflict. He was a man giving life to something beautiful, something that transcended everything they were going through. Music gave them the strength to endure. It reminded them that, despite everything, they still had the ability to create, to be human, to be something beyond the war. When they played, they weren't just filling the mess hall with sound. They were filling their own hearts, their minds, their spirits. It was the one thing the war couldn't take from them. Their survival wasn't just physical anymore. It was emotional and spiritual, woven into every note they played together, every harmony they built from their brokenness. As the weeks passed, the music became more than a daily routine. It became a symbol. For the men in the orchestra, it was proof that despite their captivity, despite the cold and the hunger and the fear, they still had something left to give, to each other and to themselves. In the most unexpected of places, surrounded by the brutal realities of war, they had created something sacred. They had found a way to survive not just the war, but the parts of themselves the war hadn't yet destroyed. And as the music filled the mess hall, it filled them with a renewed sense of purpose. It was the one thing that made them feel, for just a few minutes, alive. The first time the orchestra played for an audience, it was an act of sheer defiance, not defiance in the sense of rebellion. There were no protests, no loud cries against the injustice of their captivity, but defiance in the quiet, unspoken way that only music can convey. It wasn't just a performance, it was a statement, a message sent without a word, without a single movement other than the fingers on the strings and the breath through the clarinet. Fischer, the orchestra's conductor, had always known this moment would come. The mess hall, though a place of survival, also acted as a stage for moments of quiet interaction between the prisoners and the guards. The separation between the two sides, normally stark and insurmountable, was reduced, if only temporarily, by the shared experience of music. What began as a private escape soon became something larger, a potential for unity that no one had anticipated. The invitation to perform before both prisoners and their captors came unexpectedly. A senior German officer, intrigued by the sound of the orchestra drifting through the camp at odd hours, decided to witness it for himself. Initially, it was a curiosity, a way to pass time. But when the officer saw the orchestra, saw the strange yet harmonious blend of men who had once been enemies, he realized it could serve a greater purpose, not just to amuse, but to strengthen the sense of control, to reinforce the idea that the POWs were still, in some strange way, under command. On the day of the performance, the orchestra members were nervous, though they would never admit it. They had been practicing for weeks in secret, each session binding them closer together as musicians, as men, as human beings. But today they would perform not for themselves, but for a mixed audience, both prisoners and guards, in the same room. Their usual space, the cramped, cold mess hall, was now both a sanctuary and a battleground. The floorboards creaked beneath their feet. The guards were positioned against the walls, their eyes watchful. The prisoners, typically hunched over their meager meals, now sat up straight, some smiling shyly, others with a distant, almost nervous hope that the music would somehow bring them closer to something more than survival. As Fisher raised his baton, there was a moment of perfect silence, the kind that only happens when all expectation falls away. Then, with a deep breath, the first notes emerged. A simple piece, a song that resonated with all the men in the room. An old German folk song that spoke of longing, of home, of better times. As the music unfurled, there was something almost sacred about it. The room seemed to hold its breath. The prisoners looked at the guards, and for a split second no one was a prisoner or a guard. They were all just men, gathered together by the shared language of music. And then something extraordinary happened. The guards, once stern and distant, began to listen. The harsh lines between prisoner and captor blurred, even if just for a moment. One German officer, his uniform crisp and stiff, stood still, his eyes closed, letting the music wash over him. Another guard, a young soldier who had barely seen the horrors of the war, tapped his foot in rhythm, his face softening ever so slightly. It was as though the music had unlocked something within them, a reminder of the humanity they had almost forgotten in the trenches and camps, a reminder of the lives they had once led before the war. The prisoners, too, felt the change. For a brief moment, they were no longer just soldiers who had been captured, no longer just men defined by their countries or their uniforms. They were men, sitting in a room together, united by the shared experience of the music. There was no longer animosity between them and the guards. There was only a feeling of something much more profound: connection. The old violinist, his hands shaking from the cold, found himself looking across at one of the German officers. Instead of hostility, he saw the familiar flicker of understanding in his eyes. For a moment, it was as if the music had turned the clock back to a time before the war had stolen everything from them. But it wasn't just the music that united them. It was the unspoken acknowledgement that what they were doing was impossible. They had done it. They had created something that defied the very nature of their captivity. A prisoner and a guard sitting side by side, sharing a moment of silence as the last notes of the piece hung in the air like a fragile thread of hope. It wasn't just music. It was an act of resistance against the dehumanizing forces of the war, a quiet but powerful reminder that even in the darkest corners of the world, there could still be light. As the final chord faded, there was a moment of stunned silence, followed by a hesitant but growing applause. Not just from the prisoners, but from the guards as well. It wasn't the applause of a performance, not in the traditional sense. It was the applause of recognition, of shared experience, of the realization that despite everything, they were still human. The orchestra had succeeded in doing something that had been considered impossible. They had united enemies, not with guns or orders, but with the one thing that the war couldn't take from them: their ability to create. The mess hall, which had once been a grim symbol of confinement, became a sanctuary of sorts for the men of the orchestra. It was the only place in the camp where the rules of war and the rigid divisions between soldiers could be temporarily suspended. Normally, the mess hall was where the men went to eat, not to connect. The clatter of trays, the dull murmur of conversation, the occasional shouting of guards. It was a space where the harshness of captivity was most palpable. Every meal felt like a reminder of their position in the world. Each bite of stale bread, a small act of submission to forces beyond their control. But the music changed everything. When the orchestra played, the mess hall transformed. The air, thick with the scent of boiled potatoes and rank, sour air, shifted. It was as though the very walls of the room opened up, allowing something beautiful to flow through. Something that transcended the oppressive weight of captivity. The soldiers stopped being just prisoners or captors. In the moments when the orchestra played, they were simply human beings, sharing in an experience that went beyond the uniforms they wore, beyond the sides they fought for, beyond the deep divides created by war. At first, the transformation was subtle. A few prisoners looked up from their meals, their faces softening as the familiar strains of music filled the hall. For a few seconds they forgot the cold, the hunger, the weariness that gnawed at their bodies. The music provided a brief escape, a reprieve from the relentless grind of captivity. But soon the power of the music began to grow. The orchestra, at first tentative and unsure, began to play with a kind of quiet intensity, as though they were no longer just performing for an audience, but creating something that belonged to everyone in the room. The men who had once sat apart, separated by the visible barriers of nationality, rank, and prisoner status, found themselves drawn together by the sheer emotional force of the music. It didn't matter if they were German, American, French, or Russian. In the mess hall, for those brief moments, there was no us and them. There was only the music, and the shared experience of listening to something that spoke to them on a deeper level than the endless cycles of war and death. As the days passed and the music became a more frequent presence, the atmosphere in the mess hall subtly changed. The once volatile tension that simmered beneath every interaction between captors and prisoners began to ebb, if only for the duration of the performances. Soldiers who had barely exchanged words with each other now nodded in quiet acknowledgement. A German officer, standing against the wall, would lower his eyes as the orchestra played, and for a moment the harsh lines of his face softened, as if the weight of the uniform had momentarily lifted. A French POW, once stoic and withdrawn, would tap his foot to the rhythm of the music, his face betraying the hint of a smile, however fleeting. The guards, who had always maintained a strict and fearful distance from the prisoners, began to show signs of subtle, almost imperceptible change. Their rigid postures softened, their expressions less stern. For a brief moment they too were caught up in the music, as though the boundaries between them and the men they watched over had blurred, even if just for the duration of the song. And for the prisoners, the music became a bridge. In the earliest days of captivity, the men had kept their heads down, their conversations hushed, afraid that any hint of rebellion or even camaraderie might bring harsh retribution. But the music freed them, not in the sense of escaping the camp's confines, but in a deeper, more profound way. It freed them from the mental shackles of isolation and despair. It reminded them that, despite the war that had torn apart their lives, there was still a part of them that could connect, that could create, that could feel. By the time the orchestra had played its third or fourth piece, something extraordinary had happened. The mess hall, once a place of division, had become a place of communion. Soldiers, prisoners, and guards alike now shared something tangible. They weren't bound by the war or the brutality of their situation. They were bound by the music. And in that shared experience, the humanity that war had tried to erase began to re-emerge. What the men in the orchestra had created in the mess hall was more than music. It was a subtle act of resistance against the forces that sought to dehumanize them. It was a reminder that even in the most brutal of circumstances, there were moments of unity, of grace, of shared understanding. The music didn't change the war. It didn't bring an end to their captivity. But it did something perhaps even more profound. It reminded them that, despite everything, they could still find common ground, even if that ground was a cold, grim mess hall in a POW camp. And in those moments, when the last note rang out and the mess hall was filled with the soft murmur of applause, the soldiers knew something they hadn't before, that they were more than just the roles the war had assigned them. They were human, united in the most unlikely of places by the simplest and most powerful thing of all, the ability to create beauty in the face of destruction. The invitation came on a cold morning, wrapped in uncertainty and the faintest trace of nervous excitement. A German officer, curious about the growing whispers of music in the camp, had decided to see it for himself. The performance, initially intended for prisoners, had caught his attention. It was rare, in fact unheard of, for soldiers to engage in such an artistic display in a POW camp, especially one where emotions were raw and distrust ran high. So when the officer requested that the orchestra perform for the German officers stationed at the camp, it was met with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The orchestra members were not entirely sure what to expect. They had been playing for themselves, for the prisoners, and for the small private solace the music provided. But to play for the enemy, the very men who had imprisoned them, the men whose forces had torn apart their countries and families, was something entirely different. It was an unspoken challenge, a test of the orchestra's ability to transcend the very divide that had placed them in this predicament. Would the music still hold its power, or would the harsh realities of war tear it apart? The performance was scheduled for the evening, and the mess hall, which had become the orchestra's sanctuary, was now a space of uneasy tension. The guards, always watchful, seemed more alert than usual. They, too, had heard the whispers of the performance, and now they stood, silent and grim, at the edges of the room. The prisoners, still unsure of how to feel about playing for the German officers, were hesitant but resolute. The music had given them hope, had allowed them to reclaim something of their humanity. But would that be enough to bridge the chasm of enmity between them and their captors? As the hour approached, the camp fell into an uneasy silence. The men of the orchestra, now familiar with their roles and the intricate dance of their instruments, prepared themselves in the dim light of the mess hall. There was no turning back now. They would play not just for the guards or for their fellow prisoners, but for the men who had imprisoned them, who had watched their comrades fall, and who represented everything they had lost. When the doors to the mess hall opened, a group of German officers entered, their boots clicking on the cold floor as they took their seats. Their faces were stern, unreadable. Some of them had been present during the early performances, but tonight was different. Tonight, they were not just casual listeners. They were the enemy. They had the power to decide what would happen to these men, these musicians. Their presence, heavy and imposing, added a weight to the already taut air. Fisher, the conductor, stood at the front of the group, his baton raised, his eyes briefly meeting those of the officers. There was no malice in his gaze, but something deeper, perhaps a quiet acknowledgement that what they were about to do transcended the war. This was not an act of defiance, not an act of resistance in the typical sense. It was something more profound, an act of survival, of humanity. As the first notes began to fill the room, the tension in the air shifted. The piece was delicate, a haunting, familiar tune that spoke of longing and home. It was a song that any soldier, regardless of which side they fought for, could understand. It was a song of loss, of the shared human experience that underpinned all their struggles. As the orchestra played, the faces of the German officers slowly began to soften, the tightness in their expressions easing just a little. It wasn't just the music, it was the realization that, despite the uniforms, despite the lines drawn in the sand by war, they were all men. They were all humans. The guards, standing stiffly against the walls, found themselves caught up in the rhythm, some tapping their feet, others leaning in just a little closer to hear the music more clearly. It wasn't just a performance anymore. It was an experience, one that bridged the gap between captor and captive, between soldier and prisoner. In that room, for those fleeting moments, the war seemed distant, even unreal. The German officers, too, seemed affected. One of them, an older man, leaned forward, his hands clasped together, his face unreadable. Another, younger and more restless, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but couldn't seem to tear his eyes away from the musicians. For a brief moment, there was no hostility in the air. There was no animosity, no cold authority. There was just the music and the shared humanity that connected all of them. When the last note hung in the air, the silence that followed was heavy with meaning. The officers who had been accustomed to holding all the power in this camp now found themselves in an unexpected position, humbled by something as simple and as powerful as music. The applause that followed was not the raucous, forced clapping of a performance meant to satisfy an audience. It was genuine, subdued, the sound of men who had been reminded of something they had long forgotten. The connection between them, the shared experience that no uniform, no war could erase. And for the men in the orchestra, there was something even more significant in that moment. It wasn't just that they had played for the enemy. It was that, in doing so, they had broken through the invisible walls that separated them. For a few moments, they had ceased to be prisoners and guards. They had simply been men, united by the universal language of music. And in that brief, fleeting connection, they had found something more powerful than any weapon. They had found a way to reclaim their humanity. For the orchestra, this performance marked a turning point, not just in the camp, but in the way they saw themselves. They were no longer just victims of war or men trapped behind barbed wire. They were artists, creators, capable of bringing unity even in the most divided of circumstances. And in that mess hall, for just a moment, music had done what politics, power, and force could not. It had united them. The music, though fleeting in its presence, had left an indelible mark on the men of the POW camp. When the last note of the final performance hung in the air, the echoes of it reverberated not only through the mess hall, but through every corner of the camp. The soldiers and guards, though they would return to their grim routines, would never fully escape the brief unity the music had woven between them. It had been a shared experience, a reminder that despite the uniforms, the ranks, and the bitter divisions of war, there was something more powerful than conflict. The connection that comes from something as simple as a song. In the days following the performance, a palpable shift settled over the camp. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first. The men who had been part of the orchestra, those once defined by the numbers tattooed on their arms and the shackles of their captivity, found themselves holding on to the experience of the music like a lifeline. They spoke less about the hardship of the camp, less about the endless days of hunger and cold, and more about the sound of the music filling the mess hall, the quiet defiance of playing for both sides, and the unexpected moments of understanding that had passed between them and their captors. Carl Fischer, the conductor, found himself in quieter moments reflecting on the significance of what they had done. He had been a man driven by order and precision before the war, guiding orchestras through symphonies in grand concert halls. But now, in the midst of a prison camp, music had become more than a performance. It had become an act of resistance, not against the enemy, but against the war itself. Music was the one thing that could transcend the bitter divide between prisoners and captors, the one thing that reminded them all of their shared humanity. For Frank Miller, the clarinet player, the music had become something personal. When he first arrived in the camp, he had been a man beaten down by loss, the loss of comrades, the loss of normalcy, and the loss of hope. The act of playing music, of contributing to something bigger than himself, had reignited a part of him that he thought had been buried by the brutality of war. It gave him purpose, a reason to wake up every morning, even in the face of such despair. The music had taught him that even in captivity, he was still capable of creating something meaningful. But the true legacy of their performances wasn't just about personal transformation. It was about what they had achieved together. A bridge built through music, one that connected enemies, broke down walls, and united men who had been divided by something much larger than themselves. And for a brief moment, there was peace. The guards, who had once been strict and cold, began to view the prisoners differently. They had seen their humanity, had witnessed them create something beautiful in the most unlikely of circumstances. The higher-ups, those officers who had approved the performances, were not blind to the impact. Though they might not have fully understood the significance of what had occurred, they knew it was something rare. It had been a victory of sorts, but not one achieved through force or strategy. This victory had been achieved through something that could never be quantified on a battlefield. Art. Music had done what no number of guns or orders could do. It had humanized both the prisoners and the guards, reminded them of the lives they had once lived, and given them something to hold on to when everything else had fallen apart. Days turned into weeks, and the whispers of the orchestra's performances spread beyond the confines of the camp. There were stories shared between soldiers, passed along through the ranks, until one day a few of the higher-ranking officers from the Allied forces came to speak with Fisher and the other members of the orchestra. The story had caught the attention of those higher up, and they wanted to know more. They wanted to understand how a handful of men trapped in a war-torn camp had managed to create something so powerful. Some even wanted to bring the story back to the States to share it as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity. For the men in the orchestra, however, the recognition didn't matter. They hadn't played for accolades, and they hadn't played for glory. They had played because they needed to, because the war had taken so much from them, and music was the one thing they could still give, still offer, still control. But even as the recognition spread and the stories of their music reached places far beyond the camp, the men remained humble. They had made something beautiful in a place of brokenness, and that was enough. The war didn't end because of the orchestra. The camp didn't become a symbol of peace. The world didn't change overnight. But the men who had played together, who had stood side by side and made music, knew that they had done something extraordinary. They had created unity where there had been division, light in a place of darkness. They had, for a fleeting moment, proved that even in the worst of times, beauty could rise from the ashes of destruction. And when the war finally ended, when the men of the orchestra returned to their homes, to their families, to the lives they had once known, they carried that legacy with them. It wasn't the medals or the honors that defined them. It was the music, the simple, powerful music that had kept them alive, kept them human, and had, against all odds, united them in a way nothing else could. Years passed, and the war slowly receded into the distant past, but the legacy of the POW orchestra lived on. The men who had once played together in the bitter cold of captivity carried with them the memory of what they had achieved. A moment when, despite the darkness of war, they had found light in the most unlikely of places. Their music had transcended their circumstances, creating a bond between them that time could never break. When the war ended and the men were released from their prison camps, the world around them had changed. The scars of battle were deep, and the wounds of loss ran even deeper. But for the men of the orchestra, the war's end didn't just mark the conclusion of a conflict, it was the beginning of something else entirely. A new chapter of their lives, shaped by the unique experience they had shared. The music had become a part of them, woven into their very identities. It was more than just a means of survival. It had been their rebellion against the forces that had sought to strip away everything they were. It had given them back their dignity, their humanity. But the music didn't end with their release from the camp. It continued quietly, as a thread that ran through their lives. For some, it became a way of coping with the emotional weight of what they had endured. Frank Miller, the clarinet player, returned to New York after the war, but the city that had once seemed vibrant and full of possibility now felt cold and alien. The war had changed him, had taken away the light he had once carried. Yet when he was alone, walking the quiet streets of the city, he could still hear the music, still feel the pull of the clarinet's haunting melody. It became his therapy, his way of processing the trauma he had experienced. He would play in the evenings, his fingers moving over the keys as if the music could heal the wounds inside him. For others, the music became a symbol of what they had lost and what they had regained. Carl Fischer, the conductor, returned to Germany, but his homecoming was bittersweet. The country had been ravaged by the war, and his career as a conductor, like so many other things, had been swallowed by the devastation. Still, Fischer found solace in the memory of the orchestra. He would often gather friends and former soldiers, and together they would play the pieces they had once performed in the POW camp. It was a way of holding on to the past, of keeping the spirit of what they had created alive. It was their own small rebellion against the overwhelming grief and destruction that surrounded them. And as the years passed, the memory of the orchestra began to spread. What had started as an isolated act of resistance in a POW camp slowly grew into a legend, whispered about in military circles, shared as an example of resilience and the unbreakable human spirit. The story of the orchestra, its formation and its performances, especially the moment when they had played for both sides, became a testament to the power of art in times of conflict. The music had not just been a brief escape from the horrors of war, it had been a reminder that there was always something greater than the divisions that war sought to create. Music, the story suggested, was the one thing that could unite even the most bitter of enemies. In time, the military took notice. The Army's training division began studying the phenomenon of the POW orchestra. They recognized that what had happened in that camp, in that mess hall, was no small feat. The unity that had been created through music was something to be learned from, something that could be used to build stronger, more resilient soldiers. In the decades that followed, the technique of asymmetrical engagement sequencing, a strategy inspired by the orchestra's ability to work together despite their differences, became part of military doctrine. Though the name was dry and clinical, the core principle was the same. Unity, even in the face of division, could be achieved through understanding and shared purpose. For the men who had once been prisoners, the impact of their music didn't end with the war. It was woven into the fabric of their lives, a constant reminder that, even in the worst of times, there was still room for humanity, for connection. They had created something that had transcended their immediate suffering, a shared experience that carried them through the darkest days and remained with them long after the guns had fallen silent. And for those who had been part of the orchestra, it was not just a chapter of their past, it was their legacy. Not the medals they wore, not the battles they fought, but the music they created, the moment when, against all odds, they united and reminded the world that even in the deepest darkness, there was still light. Their music became the most profound statement of resistance they could make, a statement that survived long after the war had ended, long after the soldiers had returned to their lives, and long after the mess hall had emptied. Because in the end, the music was what remained. It was what had bound them together, even in the face of war. And it was what would never be forgotten.